Well, music has been a very important part of my life for as long as I can remember. Um, I didn't get serious about jazz or serious about music as a player until after I graduated from college. So I guess relatively late in life I got serious, at least relative to most of my peers, because most of the musicians that I play with, they had made a decision, pretty early on, that they want that was what they wanted to do. Most of the musicians that I play with went through a more formal music education system and went to music school. I didn't, and I was kind of on a completely different path, or at least a different career path. But music has been an important part of my life as a listener since I started listening. Probably even in the womb, because my mom wasn't a musician, but she was a dancer and a true music lover, and she was there was always music around the house. She loved jazz, and she loved especially, I think, some of the more bluesy and soulful exponents of the art, like Cannonball Adderley and Stanley Turrentine. There's a lot of blues music around, Sonny Terry. She loved R&B and soul, Aretha Franklin, Otis Redding. Um, she liked some classical music, but she was also a big. She was really interested in Indian and Indonesian and Middle Eastern and African dance and musics. So I grew up with all these kind of other sounds around me. She Indonesian gamelan orchestras. She took me to some performances very early on. South Indian music and dance. Um, so I think yeah, I mean, I had a pretty broad and eclectic exposure to music, and I always apparently, she says, I always loved it, and I always responded to it. She tells the story. I'm too young to remember, but she tells the story of when I was, I think, 3 years old or something. She took me to I think, one of my first concerts. It was an Indonesian gamelan concert, and apparently I was so. She says I was so excited and stimulated. When I got home, I demanded that she pull down all the pots and pans off out of the cupboard, and I arranged them from like big to small, and took like some knives and made my own little makeshift gamelan. Probably broke a few things, but um, so yeah, and I guess I mean, I've been listening to jazz really early on. I remember John Coltrane's "Love Supreme." That album, I can remember listening to that album and looking at the cover, and being kind of mesmerized and transfixed with the music from a very early age. The Beatles, Sergeant Pepper's. That's also an album I remember. So I have this kind of like not just an oral memory, but also that kind of visual and tactical memory that comes from that those of us who grew up with LPs I think have. And yeah, I mean, I just always loved music. Always it always made me feel, and it always inspired me, and stimulated me, and it was always something I was serious about as a listener. So I've always been passionate about it as a player later, but as a listener from the beginning. Well, it was probably the easiest decision I ever had to make, to be honest, because I mean, look, I mean, not to thumb thumb my nose at law school or at Yale Law School. I mean, I had an incredible opportunity, and academics were important to me, and I had a great education, and I enjoyed learning, and I believe it or not was looking forward to going to law school, but within the first 6 months that I lived in New York, 6, 7, 8 months I lived in New York during what I thought was going to be just 1 year off between undergraduate and law school. During those first 7 to 8 months, I had the opportunity to play with so many incredible musicians, idols of mine, musicians that I grew up listening to, people like Charlie Hayden and Billy Higgins and my father, Dewey Redman, and Milt Jackson and Clark Terry and Paul Motion and Jack DeJohnette. And I mean, and also some of the greatest musicians of my generation, people like Brad Meldau and Christian McBride and Gregory Hutchinson, Kevin Hayes, Brian Blade, Larry Goldings. And this was within, within a half a year basically of moving to New York. I mean, I would have been a fool not to embrace those opportunities, and it almost felt like a non-decision because I was so inspired and having so much fun and also so grateful, and I realized I was keenly aware of my tremendous fortune, how lucky I was to have those opportunities, because there were and are thousands of musicians, equally if not more deserving, who didn't or wouldn't have those opportunities as quickly. I don't think at the time I necessarily realized the gravity of the decision or the non-decision, as it were. I mean, I don't know if you really realize the gravity of your decisions ever, but especially not at the age of 22. And so at the time I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to go to law school now, whereas in reality, that decision was a life decision. I mean, I didn't realize it, but I don't, at the time, I don't think, if you had asked me, will you still be playing music? Will you be a professional musician at the age of 40 or 42, which I am now? I probably would have said probably not. For me, it was just, that was the adventure that I was on at that moment. But I thought, yeah, 10 years from now I'll be doing something else. But I wouldn't be, and I'm not, and I'm grateful for that. Generally, on the most fundamental level, what I'm striving for with music is honesty and purity and creativity of expression. I want to I want to say something. I want to express something that I have inside of me, and because it's jazz, because it's improvised music, I want to express something that I'm feeling at the moment, and to express it in as honest a way as possible, as interesting and as creative a way as possible, and also in as communicative a way as possible. And because I feel like music is a language, and music is a form of communication. And I want to communicate it to the people who are listening, the audience, but I want to communicate, this is really important to me, I want to communicate with the musicians that I'm playing with. I want to have a musical conversation. My process for writing music. Yeah, I don't really have one. I need to find one. I think it's this question comes at a appropriate or maybe inappropriate time, because I'm kind of in this zone now where I don't want to say I have full on writer's block, but it feels harder, like it's getting harder and harder for me to write these days. And I don't know if it's just that maybe I'm tapped out. I heard someone once said something like, well, everybody has whatever, every writer has 50 great songs in them, or I mean, I don't know if I've written even 50 songs, but for some reason I feel like it's more, I mean, I'm still writing, but it's not a it feels like a little more of a struggle these days, and I think that's probably because I don't have a process so much, or my process, I guess, in the past has always been, kind of wait for some sort of inspiration to come, and then when it comes, hope that I'm near a piano. So I never write on the saxophone ever. I mean, I usually write songs and don't even go to the saxophone until the end. And I've gotten myself in trouble a lot of times because I write these tunes and then I try to play them on saxophone and realize that I can't play them or that they sound bad on saxophone, but it's too late. um, but yeah, I've always, I guess, like, for me, the writing, I guess I've always wanted to feel the writing experience. I've always wanted it to be like the playing experience, like the improvising experience, in the sense that um, I want I've wanted it to come from, like, the material to come from an inspired place, to feel like I have, like, there's, like, some kind of creative light bulb goes on, like there's this initial inspiration, this seed, this germ of an idea, and I can't summon that. It just comes, and it can be a melody, or it can be a bass line, or it can be a groove, or whatever. But it's not like I've never felt like, oh, I can just, let me sit down and just start writing. I feel like some inspiration has to come, and then if I'm by a piano, or nowadays I write into the computer as well, then I can start to flesh that idea out. But I've heard and talked to a lot of composers that I really admire, and it seems like kind of across the board, the really great composers all have, or most of them have this approach of to writing as the way to write is to write something every day, and to just sit down to write, and not worry so much about feeling inspired, but just the kind of daily routine, the ritual, embracing that process and embracing the work itself, will lead you ultimately, hopefully, to something creative and inspired. So I feel like I have to kind of switch gears and get more used to that, like commit myself, if I really want to, like, keep writing, to commit myself a little more to the process and have it become maybe a little more part of my routine, musical routine. I don't know. I mean, I guess I've come to serious music rather late in the game, but practicing even later, because in all honesty, for the first 30 years of my life, I hated practicing I loathed it, and I did everything I could to find excuses for not doing it, and that's not to say that I didn't ever practice, but I don't think I ever practiced well. I think that certain things, like all musicians, certain things come easier to you, and certain things come harder. And I think I had this ability to kind of play off my strengths and cover up my weaknesses, for a long time, so that I kind of was able to skirt around, and to avoid to avoid really practicing. And I always was able, I think, I was able to kind of, like, learn through playing. I mean, I didn't practice a lot for the first 30 years of my life, but I played a lot, and I played jam sessions all the time, and I feel like I was able to learn a lot and to pick up a lot by playing with musicians that were better than me. I mean, and I was able to kind of grow and learn up to a point, kind of without practicing seriously. But eventually, it just caught up with me, and I realized that all these gaping holes in my musicianship. There's only so much dirt I had to throw into the holes, to cover them up. So I guess around the age of, I guess I was 30 or 31, somewhere around there, I kind of started getting serious about practicing. And unfortunately, by that time, although I was serious about it, I had so much going on career wise and life wise and responsibility wise that I didn't have that much time I could devote to it. But for me, since then, I guess it's been like, I try to get to the saxophone every day. These days with two kids, I'm lucky if I can get a half hour. For me, like 2 or 3 hours that's a marathon. Um, but what is my approach? What do I practice? Well, I've definitely I've spent a lot of time, I guess earlier on, working on my sound, long tones, really basic things. I tend to practice fundamental type things, whether they be long tones or I guess I don't really, I kind of develop my own little exercises, but I don't, when I practice, it's generally, I'm not practicing things that I'm thinking about playing. I'm practicing things that I feel are either just like fundamental fundamental aspects of playing the saxophone or musicianship, or little things that I might develop for myself, that target weaknesses. I think the one thing that I've always had, I haven't had a good work ethic or a good practice ethic, but I think I've always been really, uh, I'm a good critical listener, and an especially good critic of myself, and I think I've been able to listen very honestly and very critically to myself over the years, so that I have been able to hear my weaknesses and recognize them and kind of face them, and then over time figure out ways to address them. I wouldn't say I've done a huge amount of transcription, but transcription has been hugely important. Maybe I've transcribed 20 solos, but that is more than anything else the way that I've kind of immersed myself in the vocabulary of jazz. And there was a period of time. Um, I guess when I was in college, I transcribed like 4 or 5 Sonny Rollins solos, and then 4 or 5 Dexter Gordon solos. Later on, I got really into Stan Getz, transcribed some of his stuff. Learned some Lester Young solos, just like a chorus or two or half a chorus by ear. Um, and at a certain point, I realized that it was better for me not to not to transcribe in the sense of writing down, but to learn them by ear, and it takes longer, but I internalized it better. I'd say Sonny Rollins, John Coltrane, probably my biggest influences on the saxophone, followed closely by Stan Getz, Lester Young, Dexter Gordon, my pops, Joshua Redman, Joe Henderson, Wayne Shorter. Yeah, and that's on the saxophone. My experience and my path to whatever you want to call it, to this life, to whatever success that I've had, has been so atypical. It's been such an anomaly, and it's kind of not a replicable one. It's like I wouldn't recommend doing what I did, which was like not being serious about music for 22 years, and then and then moving to New York, and it's just I was super fortunate. Um, I think, at the risk of sounding cliche, but cliches exist for a reason, right? I think you've got to, you do it and you choose it because you love it, not because you want to make a great living at it. Not because you want to be famous, not for the success. You know, uh, it's not it's not an easy life being a jazz musician, even being a relatively successful jazz musician. And I haven't had to pay a lot of the dues that a lot of musicians have. It's especially these days with the state of our economy and the state of our culture. The jazz business it's tough, But I think the one thing I have found that that in general, musicians who are truly dedicated to the music and love the music for the music's sake, and for the sake of playing, they find a way to make it work. So really, I think if you want to have a career in the music, you have to fall in love with the music, and you have to love the music, and you have to treat it with the respect and the humility and the awe that it deserves and that it demands. And I think you've got to listen as much as you can. Listen as much as you can to the musicians that you love, and listen maybe even to the musicians that you hate, because that'll teach you something about what your musical tastes are and what your musical values are. And try to listen if you want to play jazz. Jazz is a incredibly deep and complex language that's been spoken and developed and refined over 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 a century, over more than a century, I guess. And I think it's important to listen to great music from many different eras, because I think that, like, I know when I started listening, some of the first musicians that I listened to, I guess, were, uh, at least saxophonists were Coltrane and Rollins. But I know that when I started listening to musicians like Ben Webster and Lester Young and Louis Armstrong and Coleman Hawkins, that I gained such a greater appreciation, and insight and knowledge, about what musicians, later more modern musicians, were doing. So I think it's important to listen to as much music from as many different time periods as possible. And I think it's important to listen to the musicians that you're playing with, listen to your peers. Listening is the most important thing, and listen to yourself, and listen honestly and critically to yourself. As a jazz musician, I feel like I don't concern myself too much with the future or the past, because for me, more than anything, jazz is the music of the present. Jazz is improvisation, it's spontaneity, it's being in the moment. And I think somehow the present can, encapsulate and encompass everything, because if you're playing honest and true in the present, if you're playing or writing or thinking or creating in the present, you're naturally going to be drawing upon everything that you've learned and experienced in your life, and everything that you've heard in the past. So that is going to be there, and the tradition, the history is going to be represented, I think. And you're also, if you're really committed to playing something that you're feeling and that you're thinking right now, it is going to have a forward-looking nature. It's going to have an innovative quality, because it is going to be fresh. It is going to be new, because it's going to be true to what's happening for you there at that moment. And so I think, in a way, you will be, jazz is a music that, if you remain true to that principle of spontaneity and improvisation and being in the moment, it has this natural forward motion to it, and naturally will evolve. And it has. I think that the music is in a really wonderful place now creatively. And there are so many great musicians. I think in a way, there have never been more great, accomplished musicians out there. It's a struggle, I think, for a lot of musicians, in terms from a nuts and bolts, and from a just just a pure like survival standpoint these days. But I think the music is in a really, really interesting and creative place. And I think as long as that remains true, the music is going to survive and it's going to thrive.